In this session, we will introduce role-based security and access control in OutSystems. We will start by defining what access control is, and why it's important. Then, we will talk about end users of our apps, as well as roles and how can we use them to grant permissions. We will finish the session with a discussion on the several ways to check for user permissions in OutSystems apps. So, what is access control? Access control determines and enforces who can do what in our apps. By who, we mean the IT users, or groups of IT users with a certain role. While the what defines resources or actions we allow those users to take, such as accessing screens, or adding certain data to the database. In general, access control comprises authentication and authorization. Authentication is about who does something. We need to identify who is accessing our app and then validate their credentials, like username and password. Then we have authorization, which is about what someone does. This requires that we validate if a certain user has the required permissions to do what they want to do. Let's now start by defining who are the end users of our apps. In the OutSystems Developer Cloud, end users are managed in the vODC portal. This portal is the default OutSystems Developer Cloud user provider, and it has a backoffice that you can access using the browser. Users can be invited to the organization by an administrator. The users invited will receive an email for them to join the organization, and where they must create a username and password. This username and password is what distinguishes every user in the organization. Now that we have users, it is important to determine what they can do. In OutSystems, authorization is granted via roles. Every user that has a username and password in the organization can have roles assigned to them. It is through the roles, and the permissions defined on the apps, that users will have access, or not, to certain features of the apps. Users do not need to have roles assigned to them, but then they will only be able to access to features that everyone, even without username and password, can access. You can create as many application-specific roles you want to, and use them as well to handle authorization in your applications. Every created role has 4 built-in actions that you can use to check if a user has a certain role, to grant a role to a user and to revoke a role from a user. As we discussed before, authorization is granted via roles. So, to grant authorization, we need to assign roles to users. There are 2 ways to assign roles to users. We can assign roles to users directly in the vODC portal. Each user's page has a section to manage roles, where the list of roles and apps will appear. Then, it's just a matter of assigning the role of the particular app to the user. But we can also grant roles programmatically, using the built-in grant role action. This action expects the user identifier, and assigns the respective role to the user, and it can be used in server action logic flows. We have been talking about granting, but there's also the option to revoke the role from a user, either through the vODC portal, or programmatically using the revoke role action. We already know how to assign roles to users, so that they have the permissions to do whatever the role allows them to do. However, how do we define those permissions? How do we check if a user can perform a task? Well, roles can be checked in screens and actions. There's an accessible by property in every screen. That property has a drop-down where we define that everyone can access the screen, regardless if they have a user created with username and password. Basically, there's no need to log in. Or we can define the screen to be accessible only by authenticated users. When that option is selected, the list of roles defined in the application appears to be selected. If a role or group of roles is selected, only the users in the system with the roles selected will be able to access the screen. Also, there are the check role actions. These actions are automatically created with each role added to an application, and they check if a user has that particular role assigned to them. There are 2 check actions, a client and a server action that can be used in client and server-side logic respectively. These actions allow developers to build logic flows that ensure that only the users with a certain role are authorized to perform a certain task. For instance, in the illustrated logic flow, First, there's an if that checks if the user has the HR manager role, using the check role action. If it does, then the employee is created in the database, otherwise an exception is thrown. The client action can also be used directly in the UI, specifically in screen widgets. Some examples of that are the conditions of the if widget, in a very similar fashion to what is done in the logic, but also as the definition of the enabled, visible property of an widget. For instance, the illustration demonstrates a widget that is only visible if the user has the role. Otherwise, it will be hidden in the screen. In sum, there are three parts that compose access control. Administrators register and manage the end users in the ODC portal. Then, users can have roles assigned to them, from multiple apps. And finally, the app can check if a user has the permissions to perform a certain task, based on a role. This helps us define logic that guarantees that only users with a certain role can perform a particular task. This can be done on the client and server side, but be aware that client-side logic is more susceptible to attacks, so it is important to protect your sensitive data and logic on the server side.